Canada isn't this utopian, peaceful democracy that upholds high, human rights standards. It's a facade, and there's a rumbling going on here in this country. And it's time that these outstanding grievances and differences be reconciled, and we're, at a major turning point in our country.
This painting is called The Fathers of Confederation. It was commissioned by the Canadian government shortly after the creation of Canada and was exposed in the Parliament in 1884. In it, you see the founding fathers of Canada with, in its center, Sir John A. Macdonald, the first Prime Minister of Canada. In 1916, the burning of the Canadian Parliament destroyed the painting, but it was recreated in 1968 by Rex Woods and is now hanging in the Parliament. But Rex Woods won't be the only artist who would reproduce the Fathers of Confederation. In 2016, Toronto-based Indigenous artist Kent Monkman painted the scene with one slight adjustment. He added a portrait of his gender-fluid and time-traveling alter ego, Miss Chief Eagle Testicle. Miss Chief is nude, subversively and defiantly posing in the middle of the room under the uncomfortable stares of the various fathers. Monkman's Daddies depicts a powerful national symbol, the founding fathers of Canada in the process of building a country. But he doesn't paint the symbol to venerate it or to celebrate it, he does it to question it. When we're looking at this painting, we're forced to think, why are none of the fathers Indigenous? The fathers are seemingly uncomfortable at the sight of Miss Chief Eagle Testicle, and this discomfort might not be because Miss Chief is gender fluid or because she's nude. I'm willing to bet that the fathers are uncomfortable because Miss Chief is Indigenous. Monkman's work sheds light on Canada's horrible, genocidal, and colonial history. Reclaiming the historical and artistic space robbed from Indigenous peoples during the past centuries is no easy task. In 2017, for the 150th anniversary of Canada, Monkman presented Shame and Prejudice, a story of resilience. Through this project, you revisit Canada's colonial history, a history that obviously isn't celebrated nor remembered. It's the kind of shameful history that a nation would rather keep secret and forget about. It's the kind of history that invalidates the slogan, "The world needs more Canada." Monkman, through incredible narrative compositions, reminds us that Canada has a long, dark, and oppressive relationship with the First Nations, and that this relationship is not only past, but also painfully present. There is so much to go through if we want to look at the different ways Canada has historically oppressed Indigenous peoples. It's not only an extremely complex issue, but it's an issue that runs through the very roots of the Canadian nation. For that reason, I decided for this video to only focus on one single Canadian institution. It's only one of the dozens of facets to this problem. So, the one thing that caught my attention while going through Monkman's work was the representation of the RCMP, or the Royal Canadian Mounted Police, or the Mountie. To learn more about it, I contacted Dr. Steve Hewitt, senior lecturer at the University of Birmingham, who specialized in the history of the RCMP, and here's what he had to say about the perception of the Mountie.
Often when you think of the Mountie and the Mountie or the Mounties, you see them in popular culture. So, for instance, they've frequently appeared in episodes of The Simpsons. You've seen them in Hollywood films. And they're often sort of benign, almost friendly characters. And again, depending on what part of Canadian society you're from. So if you grew up like me as a white person, as someone of sort of European heritage, you might see the Mounties as this sort of friendly institution that's there to protect you. But again, change perspectives, think in terms of Indigenous peoples, their historic interaction, and it's a very different history. And I think if you're living outside of Canada, it's very easy to see this symbol as just a symbol, but there's actually substance to that symbol. This is not simply a national symbol. This is a police force. And this is a police force that for over a century has helped to control the lives of Indigenous peoples. And that was true in the 19th century, it was true in the 20th century, and it's true still in the 21st century.
And the RCMP, as an institution in charge of controlling the lives of Indigenous peoples, is heavily depicted in Monkman's work. In The Subjugation of Truth, you see Chief Poundmaker and Chief Big Bear, Cree chiefs from the 19th century who were both criminalized for standing up to colonial forces. They are chained, stone-faced, and strong as they are being lectured by white settlers. Miss Chief Eagle Testicle, dressed as Queen Victoria, watches over the scene. On the left, you see Sir John A. Macdonald, not only one of the founding fathers of Canada, but also one of the founding fathers of the RCMP. He's looking proudly and approvingly at a Mountie. The Mountie, though only halfway through the frame, is extremely important in this composition. He is the bridge between the chiefs and the settlers. The chained men aren't listening to the colonizers. These colonizers have told them nothing but lies, hence the title of this painting. The only thing that is linking the Cree chiefs and the settlers isn't words, compromise, or an alliance. The one thing that is linking them is force that can only be carried out by the man in red, the Mountie. The hand on Poundmaker's shoulder is the perfect symbol for this paternalistic use of force and illustrates the relationship between the colonizer and the colonized. But perhaps the most shocking and poignant representations of the RCMP are in Monkman's paintings depicting Canada's residential schools, or more specifically, the moment when Indigenous kids were forcibly taken from their homes to be educated or re-educated by the Canadian government and the clergy. In Monkman's The Scream, you see this extremely violent operation led by both the RCMP and the clergy. The composition evokes so much force and movement. It seems like there's so much being pulled and torn from a child's limbs to a woman's clothes. This illustrates the rupture between the children and their homes, all of it enforced by the RCMP. The goal behind these residential schools was to assimilate Indigenous children, to make them good little Europeans, or, as it was famously put, to kill the Indian in the child. This violent analogy became at times too literal. As many as 30,000 residential school children were either found dead or went missing. To learn more about the situation, I spoke to award-winning human rights journalist Brandi Morin. Being Cree and Iroquois herself, she has written many articles on the subject of human rights violations against Indigenous peoples in Canada, and she also hosts a fantastic podcast titled Indigenous News and Views, which I strongly recommend. I will link it in the description. Here's what she had to say about the residential schools.
The residential school legacy began in the late 1800s here in Canada, after the government issued the Indian Act into legislation. So this was, not too long after this country was confederated. And residential schools were put in place to assimilate Indigenous children into the mainstream culture and remove them from their homes from their families, from their cultures, and strip away their identities and their language. So there were hundreds of these schools built across Canada, and they operated until 1996. So for well over 100 years in this country. And kids were taken at 5 years old until 16 years old and forcibly removed from their parents. And their parents couldn't see them for most of the year. If they were lucky, they could go home in the summertime. Children were beaten and abused, sexually at these schools, and abused emotionally, verbally, and spiritually. They weren't allowed to speak their languages, which in most cases it was their first language. They didn't know English, but they were punished and hit for speaking their language. They were houses of horrors for thousands and thousands of Indigenous kids that left these kids absolutely broken. And then when they were 16, just threw them back out, into society. These kids that were, molested and, severely abused.
We then talked about a visit she made at one of these old residential schools, which was, to her, an extremely heavy experience. The visit was all documented in one of her articles, which I'll link once again in the description. We also talked about how the damages inflicted by these residential schools weren't only done to the victims directly, but also to Indigenous families and communities. This is known as intergenerational trauma.
So a lot of people that went through these schools, suffered from that trauma, and they pass that trauma on to their children and their grandchildren. So we have these generations that are dealing with this intergenerational trauma, because it's not like, it's more than the abuse. Like, their identities were literally stripped from them. So, we are a new generation. We are a generation that is learning and healing from this, but there's a lot of damage, that was done, that we're still trying to put back the pieces, together and regain and, restore, and reclaim who we are as Indigenous peoples.
Brandi then gave me an example of how much damage this kind of experience can do to people, families, and communities.
These schools, the last one closed in Saskatchewan in 1996, and I actually met a young woman who attended a residential school, and she was younger than me, and she had a really, really rough life. She was from Saskatchewan, and she got into a lot of, crime and addictions and stuff like that in her adult life. And she was really crying for help. She wanted help to get out of this system, to get out of this cycle that she lived in. She, would be in jail most of the time or in a halfway house. So I met with her when I was with the Aboriginal People's Television Network. I went down to Calgary and met with her and did a profile on her. Her name is Josie Pelletier, and we kept in touch here and there. I kind of felt helpless because she would always call and desperately want help and just more support than what's out there in these systems for healing, right? And to get out of that life. But in 2018, Calgary police shot her dead, and her son was with her. And it's just so indicative of these cycles of violence and trauma. But she was a residential school survivor that was just abused and put back out there and kind of left to figure it out on her own, and it just ended in tragedy.
This story isn't an isolated case and is indicative of a fundamentally broken system. The RCMP forced these children into miserable situations meant to break them, and then once these children get out of these situations completely broken, the same RCMP incarcerate them or shoot them. Even though they make up for 5% of Canada's population, 30% of inmates in Canadian prisons are Indigenous. This problem is a systemic one, as recognized by Prime Minister Justin Trudeau, head of the RCMP Brenda Lucki, and a majority of Canadians.
You know, we already know that there is systemic racism within the justice system and the police, force as well. So, again, our people are targeted for violence and brutality, and have these different encounters with police, and more than anyone else. So, it's a white system designed for white society. It's not gonna. There's just a cycle in these systems. These systems are designed to oppress Indigenous people from the get-go. The RCMP was established to clear the plains of the Indian problem. It was, the RCMP were the ones who ripped these children out of their parents' arms, enforcing the law to send these children to these houses of horrors.
Brandi isn't wrong about the RCMP's origins and how it was created to clear the plains from the Indian problem. Here's what Steve Hewitt had to say about it.
I think people, if you want to envision the Mounted Police, and this is a force that came into existence in 1874. It was first deployed to the newly acquired Western Territory, but it was actually created in 1873. And the model to think of, or the notion to think of, is this is a colonial police force. And it's not hidden away, this colonial history, because Sir John A. Macdonald, who was Canada's first prime minister, when he was the driving force behind creating the Mounted Police, and he was looking for a model for the Mounted Police. He didn't look to sort of a traditional police force of the type you might see in the UK at the time. He actually looked to Ireland, which was a British colony, and he looked to the Royal Irish Constabulary, which was a sort of paramilitary force created by the British to help keep Ireland under control. So the model from the start of the Mounted Police, and indeed the name the Mounted Police right there, in a sense, gives it away that this isn't an ordinary police force, but this is very much a colonial police force that's created to bring Euro-Canadian society and perceptions and conceptions of Euro-Canadian order to this newly acquired territory in the west of the country, where obviously you have Indigenous peoples who are living. The Indigenous peoples are seen as not being a society that's capable of adjusting to European ways, especially when it comes to farming, and therefore they're perceived as an impediment to the development of what would become Western Canada. So they need to be moved on to reserves, and you need a police force effectively to go and help ethnically cleanse that Western territory.
And when did that role of the RCMP, the colonial police, ended?
I would argue it's still a colonial police force. I mean, again, just think of the protests you see in Canada and you've seen over the last few years when it comes to Indigenous peoples, say in New Brunswick, for instance, Indigenous peoples protesting over fracking. What police force is deployed to deal with them? It's the Mounted Police. Same in British Columbia, where you've had protests over pipelines. So it's still very much a colonial police force. And one of my arguments that I've made over the last few years is, if you think of again, the initial model is Ireland. Eventually, obviously, Ireland becomes a republic, but the British carve out the northern bit of Ireland to create Northern Ireland. And they create something called the Royal Ulster Constabulary. It's a police force for decades. in Northern Ireland, effectively, again, a colonial police force. So when the peace agreement is signed in the 1990s, one of the ways to bring about peace, to bring about reconciliation, is actually to create a new police force, the Police Service of Northern Ireland, and to do away with that colonial police force. So to me, going forward, if there is any basis or any substance to all the talk about reconciliation with Indigenous peoples, that I really think the Mounted Police in its current form has to go, because it does have this really heavy historical baggage.
I finally asked both guests if they thought the RCMP could be reformed.
I don't know if it'll happen within the force, because it's just such a system that has operated in this way for so long. I don't even know if it's possible for that to shift. But there is possibility with, a new generation. So there's younger generations that are coming up, and maybe they, want to learn and be serious about reconciliation and, learn cultural protocols and history.
One of the problems with the Mounted Police that makes it different from other police forces is it isn't just a police force. It's also, for many, a symbol of the nation, a national symbol, and in the minds and eyes of some, probably a sacrosanct symbol that can't possibly be changed. So I think that makes it much more difficult to reform and change an institution when it's not just an ordinary police force. It's also this national symbol with, again, this sort of almost imaginary history that intersects with popular culture. I think that makes it really difficult to have any kind of proper reckoning and reconciliation. That's one of the reasons why my argument is that actually you need an entirely new institution. I just think there's too much historical baggage around nationalism to have a proper, honest conversation.
And I feel like this untouchable national symbol that the Mountie has become, Monkman is unpacking its heavy historical baggage. I think one of the reasons why Monkman's Mounties left an impression on me is because he's representing them in a role which we refuse to attribute them. It's a whole other face of the RCMP that the average white Canadian and the world does not see. Monkman reminds us that the Mountie is more than a symbol. The Mountie is more than a ceremonial costume. The Mountie is, and has always been, a colonial weapon.
I'm just glad that it's other people are getting upset about it. At least that shows that people care. And, there's just so much going on right now. It keeps getting worse. It keeps building up. And it's it's a lot. It's a lot to handle. Like for me, especially, I'm doing it day in and day out with the work that I do. And it's just, everything's escalating, and we got to do something before we crash and burn. I swear it's just not a good, the way things are going. There are good things happening, but again, there's a lot of ugliness that's rearing its head right now. And if we don't take it seriously, we're going to really be in a lot of trouble as a country.
Thank you so much for watching. I hope that you found this video interesting and that you learned a thing or two about my country, Canada. I'll leave some more links in the description if you wish to learn more about the situation. Thank you so much, Brandi Morin and Steve Hewitt, for contributing to this video. It's greatly appreciated, and your work is incredibly important. And I'd also like to thank You Design I Write, as well as all my other patrons. If you also want to support the channel, check out patreon.com/thecanvas.